Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Russell Matthews here, and apparently Canadians spend so much on housing simply because that's what we like to do. Or at least that's the opinion of one of Canada's top economists. And with headlines like this claiming that Canadian households now need up to 34 years of savings for a down payment, and others like this claiming that if you want to buy a typical home in Canada, you're going to need an income of up to $230,000, it's becoming pretty clear just how challenging it is for home buyers to get into this market. That's why in today's video, we're going to break down this opinion that Canadians spend so much on housing just because they simply want to, and why I think this probably isn't really the case. We'll get into what I believe is the real reason we've seen these soaring house prices over the past year in many markets, as well as what the government's doing about it and what you personally can do about it. And if you find videos like these helpful and appreciate the Canadian-focused content, then feel free to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. All right, let's get into this. First off, I have to show you this new data. It shows how much more Canadians spend on housing versus Americans. Now, this data is adjusted to take into account the exchange rate between the Canadian and American dollar, as well as the average income and how much every dollar can buy in each country. After adjusting for all of those things, we can see that Canadians spend 46% more on the average home. Whereas Americans spend around $350,000 on the average home, again adjusted for all of these factors we talked about, Canadians will be closer to $600,000 for a similar product. So the question is, why? Why do Canadians spend so much more on housing than our American counterparts? That's where this theory that we pay more for housing simply because we've made the choice to do so comes into play. And that's an opinion that's just been reported by Douglas Porter, who is the chief economist for BMO. He just wrote an analysis on this gap between how much Canadians spend and how much Americans spend on housing. Let me share with you one of his main insights. He states that Canadian home prices are expensive simply because Canadians want them to be, and that we may have made a collective choice to allocate more resources to housing than other countries. But he doesn't, however, think that it's a misalignment of resources as would be typical in a bubble. And then he also states that while some dismiss it as consumption, who's to judge if this type of consumption is better or worse than other forms of spending? To break this down a bit, essentially what he's saying is that we as Canadians, as a broad society, have just become okay with spending more and more and more of a portion of our income on housing. But to support his idea, he says that maybe this isn't so much of a bad thing, rather it's just we're putting our resources into one space, housing, more than other forms of spending, maybe on more consumer goods. As a realtor who works in the Greater Toronto area, many of the clients that I've worked with would far rather portion a smaller amount of their income to go towards housing if that was something that was actually realistic. I think it's pretty silly to claim that the increase of prices we've seen is a result of Canadians being okay with spending more of a portion of their income on housing. I think that external factors as well as a change in government policy is really what is pushing up these soaring house prices that are reaching all-time highs right now. Now here is where things get really interesting. I'm going to explain to you how what the government is saying they're doing to help make housing more affordable for Canadians is actually potentially not what they truly believe, and how their actions have actually led to this huge increase of housing prices. But before I tell you what the government is actually doing when it comes to Canadian housing, let me tell you what they're sort of trying to make it look like they're doing to the average Canadian citizen. Take a look at this clip from 2019 when Justin Trudeau was talking about what his plans were in order to help Canadians get into the market for the very first time.
We listened to Canadians over these past few years talk about the fears that they or their children will never be able to own their own home. And because we believe in investing in our people and our communities, we decided to act. Our government is taking real, concrete steps to make sure home ownership remains an accessible dream, not just a privilege afforded to the richest few.
So what he's saying here is, okay, hey guys, we hear you, we recognize that it's getting more and more difficult to get into the market, here's what we're going to do. And he's referring to two things that their government did to try to make it easier for people to get into the housing market. The first thing he's talking about is how they've increased the amount of money you can take out of your RRSP accounts to go towards your down payment for your first house. Okay, not bad, that's a little bit of an improvement. And the second thing that he was talking about in this press conference was something called the first-time home buyer Buyers Incentive Program. I know, it's a mouthful. This was a program that was implemented in 2019, and the idea was that if you were somebody who was trying to get into a home for the very first time, the government would actually give you 5 to 10% of the amount of the price of that home as an interest-free loan in order to try to reduce the amount of money you're paying monthly for your mortgage payments. But there was a catch. There were a whole bunch of eligibility requirements that would make this not really a feasible program for many people who were looking to buy a home. One of the main problems was that in order to be eligible for this program, the house you're buying couldn't be more than 4 times the amount of your yearly qualifying income for the mortgage. This means even if you had an income of $100,000 a year, you would only be able to use this program for a house that's $400,000. Now, in many markets in Canada, it's becoming increasingly hard to find a home at that price. And on top of that, it was revealed that in the vast majority of cases, as a home buyer, you would qualify for a smaller mortgage using this new program than you would if you were to just ignore the program altogether. This article does a good job of giving you an example of this. They say that a qualified borrower making $60,000 a year and putting 5% down, for example, could afford roughly a $269,000 home with a regular default insured mortgage, but only $253,000 using the first-time homebuyer incentive, and that's 6% less. And this just simply does not work for first-time home buyers. As a first-time home buyer, your goal in many cases is to qualify for the highest mortgage you possibly can in order to try to be able to afford one of these increasingly high expensive houses. So as a result of all of this, nearly nobody used this first-time home buyer incentive program, which is why I'm starting to believe that the government actually cares a whole heck of a lot less about the affordability of homes in Canada, especially given the decisions they've made since the start of the pandemic. Let me show you what I mean. It's no secret that since the beginning of the pandemic, the Canadian economy has been struggling. And as a result, the Canadian government responded with a whole bunch of different ideas and plans in order to stimulate the economy to make things not look quite as bad. And one of the strategies they chose to use, which is pretty much invisible unless you do a bunch of digging on the topic, is by pumping real estate prices. Now, in order to understand how and why they did this, you need to first understand how the issuance or the creation of new mortgages affects the economy as a whole. When a bank creates credit or gives somebody a mortgage to buy a house, it's essentially adding all of that money for the mortgage into the economy. The home buyer who just got that mortgage takes that money and uses it to buy a home, and the seller of that home is able to take that money, and depending on how much they owed on their mortgage, there's likely a huge chunk of change in there that they now have made on the appreciation of the house. The idea is that the seller, who now has all of this extra money, will go out and spend it in the economy. Maybe they'll buy new furniture or just buy new consumer goods, essentially boosting the current Canadian economy. People are also able to do this without even selling their home by using something called a cash out refinance, which is a way that you can sort of pull out the equity or the value in your home that's grown over the years in order to spend this in whatever way you see fit. But to simplify, new mortgages and new refinances means more new money going into the Canadian system in an effort to get people to spend this money to stimulate the economy. But the thing is, if you give out more mortgages to more people, that's going to add competition into the housing market and inflate real estate prices. And that's exactly what the Canadian government, along with other Canadian financial institutions, did at the beginning of the pandemic. Take a look at this paragraph. Now, it uses a lot of financial jargon that makes it more complicated than it really needs to be, but essentially what it says here is that the Canadian government, along with these other institutions, has allowed for these biggest Canadian banks to lend way more money than they could before, up to $300 billion of additional lending capacity. They did this by lowering something called the capital reserve requirements. Now, this is essentially something to explain how much money a bank can lend out versus how much money they have saved away. So essentially, these biggest banks in Canada have $300 billion worth of extra money that they can lend out on mortgages and other sort of lending products. And of course, if the banks have so much extra money to lend out, they're going to be incentivized to lend that money out because they can make money on the interest. And what do we remember from before? That's right, if more mortgages are issued, home prices are going to shoot up. So my main point here is maybe the government isn't actually as concerned as you may think with this home affordability issue. And this is just based off of the policy that they're putting through. They tried to make it more affordable for people with this first-time home buyers incentive, but they made the program in a way that nobody was really using it. And at the same time, they're going to implement all of this additional lending, shoot at real estate prices up, making it even more unaffordable for people to get into the housing market. It seems like they're implementing these programs to say, hey, look, we did something about housing affordability in Canada. We're working on it. Look, guys, we're doing something. But at the same time, while you're not looking, they're implementing these other policies that effectively shoot Canadian housing prices up hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about the way the government's decisions have really caused these real estate prices to shoot up, I'd really recommend checking out another Canadian YouTuber, Steve Saretsky. I'll link to his channel on the description of this video. Great insights there. And here's something else I found really interesting. It seems that these decisions aren't just happening in Canada, and what's playing out in Canada's largest cities is part of a worldwide pattern, and house prices in 32 member countries of OECD are growing at their fastest pace in 15 years, with price growth in virtually every single country, and this is from data from the National Bank of Canada. So if the Canadian government isn't really doing anything to make it more affordable to get into the housing market, and in fact they're actually doing the exact opposite, making it less affordable, what is there that you can do in order to sort of make the best of this bad situation? Well, to be honest with you, we are in an unprecedented situation that we've never seen here in Canada before. We've seen sort of economic turmoil in the past, but we haven't seen such a strong response from the government and from these financial institutions. So it really comes down to individuals in Canada being forced to take extreme actions with the way they view their finances, trying to prioritize increasing your savings rate as much as you possibly can. And that means potentially making lifestyle changes if you're planning on wanting to get into the housing market. In order to save as much money as you need to for a down payment right now, let alone qualifying for a mortgage, you're going to have to change what you do and how you live. That could mean moving to a cheaper apartment or leaving a city in order to save money, or potentially moving back in with your parents if that's possible for you in order to save as much money as possible. Or if you're renting a place, trying to get more roommates in there with you, as many as possible, in order to reduce your housing expenses so you can save more and work towards that goal of owning a home if that's really important to you. For young Canadians, we have to take more and more extreme actions in order to be able to afford places like these, which is why I recommend that you try to save as much money as you humanly can and invest this money in order to try to grow it so you can get to the point where you have enough for a down payment. If you're interested in learning more about investing in personal finance, I have a playlist in the description with all my videos on that topic, so feel free to check that out. And also there's a link to the app called Wealth Simple, which is one of my favorite investing apps for beginners. So if you want to get started investing, check that out too. But all of this is such a crazy situation, and it's something we've never seen before in the history of Canada. So if you want to stay updated on this along with other Canadian news that I think could be important to you, feel free to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't already done so. Also, I'm really curious about what you have to say on this entire topic. Feel free to leave me a comment down there. I read every single one and I try to reply to as many as possible. But if you want to talk directly with me and directly with other people who are interested in real estate and what's going on in Canada, join our community Discord server. There's conversation going on in there all the time, and I'd love to see you in there. And if you love seeing Canadian focused content like this, and let's face it, I think there's not enough of it out there, then make sure to send this video to a friend who you think might find it interesting. That's the number one you can help grow channels like this on YouTube. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.